Nobody moved. That was the part that stayed with him afterward. Not what she said, not even the way she said it, but the fact that 14 people stood in that lobby and not one of them made a sound. Garrett Pell had been standing at the counter for 3 minutes. He had his documents. He had the account number written in his own handwriting on a folded piece of paper, the routing information, the reference number from the original wire transfer. He had everything they'd asked for when he called ahead. He'd done it right. He always did things right, even when it didn't matter, even when no one was watching. The teller's name tag said Brittany. She was young, maybe 24, 25, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been tested and didn't know it yet. She looked at the paper Garrett had placed on the counter, looked at his jacket, the worn canvas work coat he'd been wearing since Tuesday, since before the flights, since before the call that brought him back to Halifax early, and she looked back up at him with an expression that wasn't quite contempt. It was something quieter than that. Dismissal. "I'm sorry," she said in a voice that wasn't sorry at all. "I don't think this is something we can process at this branch." Garrett looked at the paper. "The account is registered here. I understand that, but for a transfer of this size, you'd need to. I've done transfers larger than this, at this branch." Britt smiled the way people smile when they've already decided the conversation is over. "I can give you the number for our regional office. They handle accounts that are—" She paused, and the pause did more damage than whatever word she'd chosen not to use. More complex. The man behind Garrett in line shifted his weight. Someone near the door coughed. The security guard by the entrance, a heavy-set man in his 50s named, according to his badge, Dennis, looked at his phone. Garrett did not raise his voice. He had not raised his voice in 11 years. Not since the night he decided that anger was a currency he could no longer afford to spend. "Can I speak to your branch manager?" he asked. Brittany's smile didn't change. "She's in a meeting. I'll wait. It could be a while." "That's fine." He stepped to the side the way she gestured toward a row of padded chairs along the wall. He sat down. He folded his paper in half and put it in the inside pocket of his coat. He looked at the lobby, the clean gray floor, the pendant lights, the frosted glass partition behind the teller stations. And he waited. That was a Thursday morning in November. The sky outside the windows was the color of old pewter. The harbor was somewhere beyond the buildings, invisible but present the way it always was in Halifax, the way the ocean had a habit of making itself felt even when you couldn't see it. Garrett had arrived on a red-eye from Vancouver the night before. He hadn't slept on the plane. He'd spent most of the flight going through the documents his accountant had forwarded. 3 months of statements, 2 flagged discrepancies, 1 pattern that looked like a mistake and was almost certainly something worse. He'd wanted to come in quietly. He usually did things quietly. That preference had served him well for a long time. He'd come to this branch specifically because it was not the head office. The head office knew who he was. The head office treated him accordingly, which was useful sometimes and suffocating others. This branch was smaller, a neighborhood location on the south end of Barrington Street, the kind of place where people brought problems they'd tried to solve themselves and couldn't. He'd thought he could walk in, process the transfer, and be done in 20 minutes. Instead, he was sitting in a chair by the wall, watching a potted plant, waiting. The branch manager's name was Sandra Foley. She came out of the back corridor at 11:47, 12 minutes after Garrett had taken his seat, and she walked to the teller stations without looking at the waiting area. She said something to Brittany, low, professional, efficient. Brittany said something back. Foley's expression shifted slightly. She turned and looked at Garrett. He stood. He didn't extend his hand because the counter was still between them, and it would have been awkward. He said, "I appreciate your time." Foley was in her mid-40s, with the careful, measured manner of someone who had handled difficult conversations many times and had learned that the first 30 seconds determined most of what followed. She looked at him. The coat, the faint gray at his temples, the tiredness in his face that was the tiredness of someone who had been traveling for 36 hours. And she made a decision. He could see her making it. "Why don't we step into the meeting room?" she said. It wasn't a question. The meeting room was small and functional. A rectangular table, 4 chairs, a whiteboard with the ghost of an old diagram still visible. Foley closed the door. She sat down across from him. She folded her hands. "I'm sorry for the wait," she said. And I want to understand what happened at the counter. Garrett appreciated that she'd said understand rather than apologize for. He took the paper from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. I need to move funds from account 7743-0092 to a separate holding account. The transfer amount is in the second line. I called ahead on Tuesday and was told it was straightforward. Foley looked at the paper. Something changed in her face, not dramatically, just a small adjustment, the way a compass needle swings when it finds north. She looked up. Mr. Pell, yes. She was quiet for a moment. How long have you been waiting? About 15 minutes. She nodded slowly. She looked at the paper again, then set it down. I want to handle this personally, she said, and I want to ask, is there anything else you need today? Just the transfer. Of course. She stood. I'll be right back. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she returned, she brought a printed confirmation and a pen. She walked him through every line. She answered 2 questions he hadn't asked yet. She was thorough without being deferential, which he respected. When it was done, she stood and opened the door herself. Thank you for your patience, Mr. Pell, she said. I'm sorry it wasn't smoother. It's fine. It isn't, she said quietly, and that was the moment he decided he liked her. Garrett didn't go back to the hotel. He walked south along Barrington, past the library, down toward the water, and he found a bench near the harbor that was cold and damp and nearly perfect. He sat there for 20 minutes. He watched the ferry crossing. He thought about his daughter. Megan was 9 years old. She was in Vancouver with her grandmother. Garrett's mother, Eleanor, a woman of 71 who moved through the world with the brisk efficiency of someone who had long since stopped waiting for things to get easier. Eleanor had flown out from Halifax to cover the week, which was the kind of thing Eleanor did without being asked and without making a point of it afterward. Garrett had 2 more days here, then he'd fly back, pick Megan up from school on Friday, take her to the Portuguese place on Granville she liked, pretend for a few hours that he hadn't been awake for 40 hours straight. He took out his phone and sent Eleanor a text. Still in meetings. Everything fine. Kiss Megan for me. Eleanor responded 11 seconds later. She made a volcano for science class. It erupted on the kitchen table. We're fine. He put the phone away and looked at the water. The thing people didn't understand about Garrett, the thing most people never got the chance to understand because it required knowing him past the first impression, was that the simplicity of his life was not an accident. It was not frugality in the usual sense. He wore the canvas coat because he'd had it for 7 years, and it was comfortable, and he didn't think about clothes enough to replace them. He drove a truck that was 11 years old because it worked. He lived in a house in East Vancouver that was unremarkable from the outside and exactly right on the inside because he'd renovated it himself over 3 years, weekend by weekend, learning as he went, making mistakes he fixed, and a few he'd kept because they'd become something else. He'd started Northline Capital at 33 with 2 partners and a conviction that institutional real estate in secondary Canadian markets was undervalued in ways that the industry's modeling consistently missed. He'd been right. The first fund had returned 41% over 6 years. The second had done better. The third was still running. He'd bought out his partners at 39, not because they disagreed, but because the company had grown to the point where a single decision-maker was more efficient, and they'd all known it, and the conversation had been easier than he'd expected. He was 47 now. Northline held controlling interests in 19 commercial properties across 5 provinces. One of those properties, a mixed-use development in Dartmouth, had been financed through a subsidiary account held at the very branch he'd just left. The account had been open for 11 years. He'd processed transfers through it dozens of times without incident. He'd never felt the need to explain any of this to Brittany. He wasn't angry, exactly. He was something more considered than angry, a low, steady attention to what had happened and what it meant. Not about him. He'd been dismissed before. He'd be dismissed again. The world had never promised him otherwise, and he didn't expect it to start. What bothered him was smaller and larger at the same time. The 14 people who hadn't said anything, the security guard who'd looked at his phone, the way Foley had come out already apologizing before she knew what she was apologizing for, which meant this wasn't the first time. Pattern, his accountant had written in the email subject line. The word kept surfacing. He sat with it for another 10 minutes. Then he stood up, put his hands in his pockets, and walked back toward the city. He spent the afternoon at a coffee shop on Spring Garden Road, going through the flagged statements on his laptop. The discrepancies were small. 2 transactions, 11 weeks apart, each less than $800. But they didn't match any vendor he recognized, and the reference codes attached to them were formatted differently from every other transaction in the account. He sent a detailed summary to his accountant in Vancouver and asked her to cross-reference them against the property management logs for the Dartmouth development. She called him at 4:30. "The codes don't match anything in our system," she said. Her name was Annette Sherbrooke, and she had a talent for saying complicated things without inflection, which Garrett had always found clarifying. "I ran them against every vendor and contractor we've used on that property for the past 3 years. Nothing, so they're external. They look external. I'd want to talk to the bank before I said anything more definitive. I'll handle it." He closed his laptop, left a good tip, and walked out into the gray afternoon. He called Baydgumek's regional office from the sidewalk and asked for the compliance department. The person who answered was pleasant and unhelpful, and referred him to a general inquiry form. He thanked them. He called again and asked specifically for the regional director of client services. He was put on hold for 6 minutes and then connected to a man named Arthur Reeve, who had the careful, over-moderate voice of someone who had learned to treat every incoming call as potentially litigious. "I need to discuss some transactions on a commercial account," Garrett said. 2 entries, specific reference codes that I can't reconcile internally. Reeve asked for the account number. Garrett gave it. There was a pause, the kind of pause that has a reason, and then Reeve came back with a slightly different quality of voice. Not flustered, more careful. "Mr. Pell, of course. Let me pull the account. I'd also like to come in tomorrow morning," Garrett said. "I want to discuss this in person." "Yes, absolutely. What time works for you?" 9 o'clock. "We'll make that work." He hung up and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The afternoon had gone gray-green, the way Halifax afternoons did in November when the temperature dropped and the light went flat. A woman walked past him with a terrier on a leash. Across the street, a man in his 30s was struggling to parallel park a van that was too long for the space. Garrett watched the van for a moment, then walked back toward the hotel. That evening he called Megan. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "Dad, hey, Bug, Grandma let me stay up." "I can see that. It's 9 o'clock. She said I could watch the nature show, the one with the birds, the one with the ocean things, the ones that glow, bioluminescence. That's the word." He heard her shift on the couch. "When are you coming back?" "Saturday. I'll pick you up from Grandma's. Can we go to the Portuguese place? Already planned." She was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet sometimes. Not withdrawn, just present, sitting with something. She'd been like that since she was 4. It was one of the things about her that he recognized. "Dad, yeah, is everything okay?" He looked at the window of his hotel room. The harbor lights were visible in the distance, the bridge lit up against the dark. "Everything's fine," he said. "Go watch your glowing things." "Okay." She paused. I love you too, Bug." He put the phone down and sat with it for a minute. Then he opened his laptop and kept working. The regional office was on Hollis Street, 12 minutes walk from the hotel. Garrett arrived at 8:52. He was wearing the same canvas coat. The lobby was different from the Barrington branch. Higher ceilings, more marble, the particular cleanliness of a space that exists to signal seriousness. A receptionist greeted him, took his name, and asked him to wait. He sat. He did not look at his phone. Arthur Reeve came out at 9:04. He was shorter than his voice had suggested, and more nervous in person, which Garrett noted without judgment. Reeve extended his hand. Garrett shook it. "Mr. Pell, thank you for coming in. Thank you for making time." Reeve led him through a glass door, past a cluster of offices, to a boardroom on the building's west side with a view of the street. There was coffee on the table. There were 2 other people in the room. A woman who introduced herself as Paula Strang, head of commercial compliance for the Atlantic region, and a younger man whose name Garrett didn't catch, and who didn't speak for the next 40 minutes. Garrett sat down. He took the statements from his bag, printed, highlighted, annotated in his own handwriting, and placed them on the table. "I've identified 2 transactions," he said. "These dates, these amounts, these reference codes. I can't match them to any vendor or service provider in my internal records. I'd like to understand where they originated. Strang took the statements. She looked at them with the professional attention of someone who already had some of the answers and was deciding how to sequence them. We identified these as well, she said, in our own review. Garrett waited. The reference codes appeared to have been generated internally, she said. Meaning from within the branch. She looked at him carefully. We don't have a complete picture yet, but the pattern suggests. She paused in a way that was nothing like Brittany's pause, because this pause was full of actual information. That they may not have been authorized. Fraud, Garrett said. We're treating it that way. Yes. He nodded. What's the timeline on your investigation? We opened a formal inquiry this morning. We should have preliminary findings within 2 weeks. In the interim, the account has been flagged for additional monitoring and the transactions have been frozen. Who at the branch level had access to generate these codes? Strang and Reeve exchanged a look. We can't speak to that at this stage, Reeve said. I understand, Garrett said. I'd like to be kept informed at each stage. I can provide my direct contact information, not through the general inquiry system. Of course. He wrote his number on a piece of paper and slid it across. He stood. He shook their hands, Strang's firmly, Reeve's with slightly more warmth because Reeve had been trying hard and deserved to know it. At the door, he stopped. The branch manager on Barrington, he said. Foley. She handled a situation well yesterday. I want that noted somewhere useful. Reeve said, I'll make sure of it. Garrett said, thank you, and left. The inquiry took 17 days, not 14. The preliminary findings were thorough, and the conclusions were specific. 3 staff members at the Barrington branch had been involved in a scheme that used improperly generated reference codes to redirect small amounts from commercial accounts to external accounts they controlled. The amounts were small enough individually to fall under the standard automated review threshold. The scheme had been running for 14 months across at least 6 commercial accounts. Garrett read the report in his home office on a Tuesday evening while Megan was asleep upstairs. He read it twice. He sent a response to Strang confirming receipt and asking 2 follow-up questions about the secondary account controls. She answered them the next morning. He was satisfied with the answers. The 3 staff members were terminated. 2 were referred to Halifax police. The 3rd cooperated with the internal investigation and received a different outcome that was not described in detail in the report Garrett received. And he didn't ask for more information because it wasn't his decision to make. Brittany was not among the 3. He thought about that for a moment when he read it, the fact of her absence from that list. She had been dismissive. She had been in the particular way of people who are 24 and certain, casually unkind. But she hadn't been taking money that wasn't hers. He held both of those things in his mind, and then he put them down, because they were separate things and it mattered to keep them separate. 2 weeks after receiving the report, Garrett called Sandra Foley. He had gotten her direct number from Reeve's office, which was a slightly unusual request, and which Reeve had accommodated without asking why, because by that point, Reeve had a reasonably accurate picture of who Garrett was and what he owned. Foley answered on the 3rd ring. Miss Foley, Garrett said. This is Garrett Pell. We met in November. There was a pause, Mr. Pell. Yes, of course. I wanted to call personally. I understand the past few weeks have been difficult for the branch. A shorter pause this time. It's been a lot. You ran the branch properly, he said. The people who were doing this were careful about not doing it visibly. That's on them, not on how you managed the space. Foley was quiet for a moment. I appreciate that, she said, and her voice had a quality in it that he recognized, the quality of someone who had been carrying something and had just been given permission to set it down, briefly, on a table. I also wanted to say, he continued, that the way you handled that situation the other day, when I came in, was right. You listened before you decided anything. That matters more than people think it does. Thank you, she said. She stopped. I should probably tell you that I know now who you are. In the full sense. I know, he said, and I want to say that it doesn't. It shouldn't have taken knowing that for you to be treated with basic courtesy. He said nothing for a moment. Outside his window, the Vancouver winter was doing what it did. Gray and damp and oddly soft around the edges. No, he said finally. It shouldn't have, but I appreciate you saying it. They talked for another 12 minutes about the branch's monitoring systems, about 2 procedural changes he wanted to recommend through the appropriate channels, about the spring renovation planned for the Dartmouth property. She was focused and direct and asked good questions and didn't treat him like a figure to be managed. He appreciated that too. When he hung up, he sat in his chair for a moment. The office was quiet. The hallway light was on, the one Megan always has left on when she went to sleep because she'd decided at age 6 that the dark hallway was where the scary things lived. And he'd never had the heart to argue with the logic. He could hear the particular silence of the house at night, the settle of the walls, the distant sound of traffic, the creak that came from the northwest corner of the roof when the temperature dropped. He'd built this life carefully, not quickly. He'd made choices that other people found confusing. The truck, the coat, the way he moved through rooms without announcing himself, the preference for side streets over main ones, the reluctance to have his name on anything that didn't need it. His lawyer had once told him, half joking, that he was the only person she'd ever met who seemed genuinely indifferent to being recognized. He'd thought about that for a long time afterward. He wasn't sure indifferent was the right word. He was aware instead. He was aware that recognition was a noise that could fill up a room and crowd out everything useful. He thought about the lobby on Barrington Street, the gray floor, the 14 people, Dennis the security guard, the potted plant, the woman with the contempt that wasn't quite contempt. He thought about Megan and the glowing things in the ocean and the volcano that had erupted on Eleanor's kitchen table. He thought about what Foley had said. It shouldn't have taken knowing that, and he thought she was right. And he thought the gap between what should be true and what actually was had always been the most interesting distance to measure. Not because you could close it entirely, but because the attempt to close it was the only thing that made the distance matter. He got up, turned off the desk lamp, checked the hallway light, and went upstairs. The house was quiet. The roof creaked once in the northwest corner. Outside, the Vancouver winter went on doing what it did, soft-edged and gray and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was watching. Garrett Pell went to sleep. In the morning, he would pick up Megan from school, take her to the Portuguese place, listen to everything she had to say about bioluminescence and volcanoes and the nature of glowing things, and he would not think once about the lobby in Halifax or the transfer or the 14 people who hadn't said a word. That was the agreement he'd made with himself a long time ago. The work was the work. The rest was the rest. The two had to stay separate or neither of them would survive.